Somewhere on the road to Gaza, in October of 1244, a knight adjusts the strap on his gauntlet and feels nothing. Not discomfort, not the leather biting into his wrist. Nothing at all. He has felt less and less for 2 years now. First in his fingers, then his hand, and he has stopped mentioning it to the others, because the others already know, and because there is nowhere else for a man like him to go. He rides with the Order of Saint Lazarus. Every knight beside him is dying of the same disease he is. That is not a metaphor. That is, by law, the point of the organization he serves. By the end of the next 2 days, most of them will be dead, not from leprosy, but from a sultan's army near a village called La Forbie. And the man who wrote the papal decree afterward didn't call it a tragedy so much as a bookkeeping problem. The order's leper knights, he noted, had simply been wiped out, and someone healthy would now have to run the place. If that sounds like a strange way to build a crusading order, you're right, it is. This is not a story about knights who happen to get sick. This is not a story about a charity that occasionally sent men to war. This is a story about an institution that took Europe's most feared disease, handed it a sword by force of actual written law, and then spent the next 800 years surviving popes, revolutions, and its own repeated near extinction. Right up to this year, when several different men, in several different countries, will each tell you, with total sincerity, that they are the Grand Master of the real one. At most, one of them can be right. Working out which, and how the rest got here, is what the next 20-some minutes are for. To understand how a leper ended up bound by law to carry a sword, you have to go back more than a century before that field outside Gaza, back to Jerusalem, and to a hospital whose exact birthday nobody can actually give you. Here's what the record supports, and no more. A hospital dedicated to Saint Lazarus was already functioning in Jerusalem by 1073, treating lepers years before the First Crusade even arrived. The order that grew out of it, a proper monastic body, with its own rule and its own hierarchy, seems to have taken formal shape sometime in the 1130s. Notice the gap. 40, 50 years of blurred edges between a hospital existed and an order existed, and depending on which history you read, you'll see the founding year given as 1108, 1119, or simply sometime after the First Crusade. That's not sloppy research on anyone's part. That's just what happens when an institution starts as an informal act of charity and only later gets written down as something official. The house followed the rule of St. Augustine, the standard playbook for hospital work in the Latin West. And here's where you run into the order's first real piece of self-mythology. For centuries, the Knights of Saint Lazarus liked to claim they were the continuation of much older leper hospitals in the East, going back to the rule of Saint Basil and a pedigree stretching into deep antiquity. It's a good story. It also isn't true. The medieval Catholic Church's own historians eventually called the claim exactly what it was: invented ancestry, dressed up to make a relatively young order look like the oldest hospital foundation in Christendom. You'll see this move again and again with institutions that outlive their own founding documents. When nobody's left to check your paperwork, you write yourself a longer resume. Even the name carries a small mystery that's never been fully settled. There are, depending how you count, half a dozen saints named Lazarus in the Catholic calendar. Historians still argue over which one this hospital actually honored: Lazarus of Bethany, the man Christ is said to have raised from the dead, or the unnamed beggar covered in sores from the parable in Luke, the one the rich man stepped over without a glance. Given who the hospital was built for, you can guess which reading fits the mission better. But guessing isn't the same as knowing, and nobody, then or now, has ever nailed it down for certain. What isn't in dispute is the problem this hospital was solving. 12th century Jerusalem was a frontier kingdom, permanently short of fighting men, sitting in the middle of a disease Europe treated as something close to a living excommunication. If you contracted leprosy in this world, you didn't just lose your health, you lost your place at the table, your standing, in some cases your own family's willingness to touch you. And into that gap stepped an institution willing to take men everyone else had already written off, and, within another century, hand a good number of them a weapon. That's where this gets strange, because it's about to stop being charity and start being law. Here's the reveal. Most retellings skip straight past. This wasn't a case of sick men volunteering out of desperation, or commanders quietly looking the other way while a few diseased knights kept fighting. It was written into law. Sometime around the turn of the 13th century, Jerusalem's legal code, the Livre au Roi, the Book of the King, spelled it out in plain terms. Any knight, from any order, who came down with leprosy was required to join the Domus Sancti Lazari, the House of Saint Lazarus. Not encouraged, required. And the Knights Templar, whose own rule already barred leprosy from the ranks on entry, wrote in an exit clause to match. A Templar brother who developed the disease could transfer to Saint Lazarus rather than simply be cast out. At first, that was framed as an option, a mercy. But once the Templars and the Lazarites ended up sharing quarters at Acre after 1240, the option stopped looking optional. Two of the most feared fighting orders on earth were, in effect, running a pipeline, and the diagnosis was the only ticket you needed. Think about what that actually means. You could be one of the most formidable soldiers in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, sworn to the temple, drilled since adolescence, and one bad medical exam later, you're being reassigned to the order everyone else in Christendom looked at with a kind of horrified pity. Your sword didn't get worse, your body did, and the law didn't care which. If a detail like that surprised you as much as it surprised me, the first time I read the actual statute instead of the summary, that's worth a like. It's a strange, oddly specific thing for medieval bureaucracy to have gotten so precisely right, and it's exactly the kind of detail that gets lost the more a story gets retold. Which brings us to the closest thing this story has to a famous face, Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem, remembered by history as the Leper King. As a boy of about 9, his tutor, the chronicler William of Tyre, noticed something wrong during a rough game with the other noble children. The boys were pinching each other's arms, the way boys do. Baldwin didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice. William reported it up the chain. A physician examined the arm, and the verdict came back: leprosy, in a child who would one day have to rule a kingdom permanently at war. Now, here's where I have to be careful with you, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets rounded up into something cleaner than the record actually supports. It is tempting, genuinely tempting, to call Baldwin a Knight of Saint Lazarus and be done with it. The order treated lepers of the knightly class. Baldwin was a leper of the most knightly class imaginable, and the two are constantly mentioned in the same breath. But formal membership? The sources won't give you that with confidence. What they'll actually support is narrower. Baldwin may have held a connection to the order, or received its assistance, without documentation nailing down anything closer than that. So we'll leave it exactly where the evidence leaves it. A probable connection, not a confirmed membership. And move on to what we do know for certain. What we know for certain is Montgisar, November the 25th, 1177. Saladin, flush with a string of victories, was caught off guard near a stream, with his forces scattered on a raid. Baldwin, 16 years old, his sword hand barely functional, reportedly needing help just to stay mounted, led a heavily outnumbered force straight into that gap. And won, decisively. It's one of the most lopsided upsets the Crusades ever produced, and it happened under the command of a teenager who, by every account we have, could no longer feel his own right hand holding the reins. So, a hospital that became a legal dumping ground for the diagnosed, a king who may or may not have technically belonged to it, and a battlefield reveal that's barely mentioned outside specialist reading. That's the kind of digging this channel does with every military order. Not the Hollywood version, the paperwork version, which is usually stranger. If pulling the real statutes out from under the legend is useful to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. The paperwork optimism of the last few minutes doesn't survive contact with October 1244. At La Forbie, The Order of Saint Lazarus rode out alongside the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights against the Ayyubid Sultan's army. And by the time the fighting stopped, multiple independent chronicles agree on the same grim shorthand. The leper knights of the house were essentially gone. Not decimated, gone. 9 years later, Pope Innocent IV issued a bull addressing the fallout, and it reads less like a eulogy than an administrative memo. Here's what makes it more than paperwork, though. Until that point, the Order's own rule had required its master, the man running the entire operation, to be a leper himself. That had been true since the beginning. Innocent's bull quietly ended it, letting healthy brothers take command, because there weren't enough diseased ones left alive to hold the job the rule had built specifically for them. Sit with that for a second. The rule that built this order around leprosy had just been overridden by the simple fact that there weren't enough leprous knights left alive to run it. The order rebuilt. 6 years after La Forbie, it was back in the field, fighting alongside the Templars, the Hospitallers, and Louis IX's French army at Mansoura in 1250 during the 7th Crusade. It fought again at Acre in 1291, standing with the other 4 great military orders in the last defense of the last Crusader stronghold on the mainland. And when Acre fell, so did the order's reason for existing in its original form. There was no more Holy Land to hold. The headquarters relocated permanently to the Château de Boigny, near Orléans, and the organization that had spent 2 centuries treating the sick and fighting on their behalf spent the next 3 centuries mostly as landlords, collecting rents from commanderies scattered across France, Italy, and Spain. By the late 1600s, that rental income alone ran to roughly 300,000 livres a year, spread across 173 separate commanderies, a very comfortable living for an order whose founding purpose had nothing to do with collecting rent. England tells the same story in miniature. At its peak, the order held as many as 95 leper houses across the kingdom, run out of its chief preceptory at Burton-les-Arts in Leicestershire. And then, in 1544, Henry VIII, already midway through dismantling England's monastic institutions, suppressed the English branch entirely. No dramatic siege, just a king with a list, crossing off one more religious house that had outlived its usefulness to the crown. Here's a detail worth sitting with, because it touches something we've already flagged once. You've probably encountered the word lazaretto, a quarantine hospital, still used today for isolation facilities and even the storage compartments on ships. It's natural to assume it's simply named after Lazarus, straight and clean, the same way this whole order was. It isn't, quite. The word actually comes from a blend, an unrelated Venetian hospital originally dedicated to Our Lady of Nazareth, Nazaretto, fused over time with Lazzaro, the Italian word for leper, itself pulled from Lazarus. 2 separate names collapsed into one, nudged together by the sheer number of leper hospitals that happened to carry Lazarus's name across medieval Europe. Which, if you think back to that unresolved question from earlier, which Lazarus this order was actually named for, makes a certain amount of sense. Historians still argue about it. If you've got a theory of your own, the comments are open, because on this one, genuinely, nobody has the final word. By the 17th century, the medieval order was already institutionally exhausted, rich in land, thin on purpose, and about to be pulled in 2 very different directions by 2 very different monarchies. That split is where this story actually gets complicated. Complicated starts here. In 1572, Pope Gregory XIII merged the order's Italian commanderies with the Order of Saint Maurice, a chivalric order the House of Savoy had run since 1434, creating the Order of Saints Maurice and Lazarus, under Savoy's permanent, papally confirmed leadership. That merger held. It's still holding now. The Savoy family maintains the order to this day, recognized by the Vatican, run under a title that has never technically gone extinct, even though the House of Savoy hasn't sat on an actual throne since Italy became a republic in 1946. Currently, who exactly leads it is disputed between 2 Savoy cousins, but the order itself as an unbroken institution is not in question. If you're looking for the one thread in this whole story that never actually snapped, this is it. Hold on to that, because you'll need it in about 90 seconds. Branch 2 starts in France, in October of 1608, when Henry IV folded the French Order of Saint Lazarus into a brand new organization of his own creation, the Order of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, partly a genuine act of religious patronage, and partly, historians note, a fairly transparent way to reward loyalists after his own conversion to Catholicism. This merger held too, for a while. It survived Louis XIV downgrading its prestige, survived being handed out increasingly to lesser nobles and the occasional diplomat. What it did not survive was 1791. The French Revolution suppressed it outright. No new members after 1788. And when the monarchy briefly returned after Napoleon, nobody bothered reviving it. The last Bourbon king who could have restored it chose not to. And by 1830, the French branch was formally, deliberately, allowed to disappear. Its last verified knights died off sometime in the 1840s. Full stop. End of institution. Except it isn't the end of the story. Because in 1910, in Paris, a small group of French monarchist sympathizers, among them a legitimist antiquarian named Paul Watrin, wrote a new set of statutes and announced that the Order of Saint Lazarus was back. A Melkite Greek Catholic patriarch gave it his blessing the following year. And here's the problem heraldic historians keep running into when they go looking for the thread connecting 1791 and 1910. There isn't one. No membership rolls survive. No document bridges the 80 years of silence in between. The Vatican has never recognized this revival as a genuine continuation, and has said so more than once. What you have, according to the people who've actually gone digging through the archives, isn't a surviving order. It's a new one, wearing an old order's name and an old order's cross. And it didn't even stay unified. In 1969, it split into rival factions. Historians usually call them the Malta and Paris obediences. More splits followed. A splinter group in 1995, another new branch declared in 2010 under a different claimant, a nominal reunion in 2008 that didn't fully take. Which means that right now, today, there are multiple separate men in multiple separate countries running their own investiture ceremonies, each in a green Maltese cross, insisting he alone holds the title Grand Master of the Order of Saint Lazarus of Jerusalem. And by the strict paper trail, only one lineage in this entire story has never actually broken. It isn't French, it's Italian, it's Savoy's. Here's the part worth carrying out of this video and using somewhere else, because by this point it isn't really about lepers or crusaders anymore. Think of it as a trademark dispute, the kind you've probably half followed in some other context without ever connecting it to knighthood. It's what happens when a respected name outlives the organization that earned it, and multiple later groups all want the reputation without necessarily having the receipts. Universities do this after a split. Companies do it after a bankruptcy and a rebrand. Fraternal orders, professional guilds, even sports franchises fight this exact fight, just without the papal bulls. The mechanism hasn't changed in 800 years. Only the paperwork has. That's the kind of detail that's genuinely fun to bring up at dinner. Watch someone's face change when you tell them there are several living men right now who each sincerely believe they command an order of leper knights, and at most one of them can actually prove it. So here's what actually survives contact with 800 years of politics, plague, revolution, and at least 4 separate popes changing their minds. First, the leper knight wasn't legend padding out a slow chapter of Crusades history. It was policy, a written statute, a Templar exit clause, an actual administrative pipeline that took Europe's most feared diagnosis and turned it into a military assignment. That's not the kind of detail that survives in the popular version of this story, because it's stranger than the popular version. Second, if you go looking for the Order of Saint Lazarus today, and plenty of people do, usually while researching their own family history or an odd medal in a drawer, you are almost certainly meeting a 1910 revival, not the medieval institution. That's not necessarily a scandal. Plenty of respected organizations started as someone's earnest attempt to resurrect something that had genuinely died. But only one branch of this particular story, the Savoy line, can actually prove it never stopped. Third, and this is the one worth sitting with, none of that legitimacy fight has stopped multiple rival branches from doing exactly what that original Jerusalem hospital did, showing up for people everyone else in the room has already decided not to touch. The paperwork broke. The impulse, somehow, didn't. So here's my actual question for you, and I want an honest answer, not the polite one. If you found out tomorrow that a title you'd worn proudly for years had an unexplained 80-year gap in its own paper trail, would that change how you felt about wearing it? Or does the 800-year-old reason for the thing matter more to you than whether the chain of custody holds? Tell me where you land. I'm genuinely curious which way this room splits. Because in the end, that's the real inheritance here. Not a cross, not a title, not a grand mastership 4 different men currently claim to hold. Just a very old, very stubborn idea that somebody has to take care of the people nobody else will.